Chapter 34 of The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, translated by George William Fenshaw. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 34. The reader may imagine the lazzaretto peopled with 16,000 persons infected with the plague. The vast enclosure was encumbered with cabins, tents, cars, and human beings. 2 long ranges of porticos, to the right and left, were crowded with the dying or the dead, extended upon straw, and from the immense receptacle of woe was heard a deep murmur, similar to the distant voice of the waves, agitated by a tempest. Renzo went forward from hut to hut, carefully examining every countenance he could discern within, whether broken down by suffering, distorted by spasm, or fixed in death. Hitherto he met none but men, and judged, therefore, that the women were distributed in some other part of the enclosure. The state of the atmosphere seemed to add to the horror of the scene. A dense and dark fog involved all things. The disk of the sun, as if seen through a veil, shed a feeble light in its own part of the sky, but darted down a heavy death-like blast of heat. A confused murmuring of distant thunder might be heard. Not a leaf moved, not a bird was seen, save the swallow only, which descended to the plain, and, alarmed at the dismal sounds around, remounted the air and disappeared. Nature seemed at war with human existence. Hundreds seemed to grow worse. The last struggle more afflictive, and no hour of bitterness was comparable to that. Renzo had in his search witnessed, as he thought, every variety of human suffering, but a new sound caught his ear, a compound of children's crying and goats bleating. Looking through an opening of the boards of a hut, he saw children, infants, lying upon sheets or quilts upon the floor, and nurses attending them. But the most singular part of the spectacle was a number of she-goats supplying the maternal functions, and with all the appearance of conscious sympathy hastening, at the cries of the helpless little ones, to afford them the requisite nutrition. The women were aiding these efficient coadjutors in rendering their supplies available to the poor bereft babies. Whilst observing this wretched scene, an old Capuchin entered with 2 infants, just taken from their lifeless mother, to seek among the flock for one to supply her place. Quitting this spot, and looking about on every side, a sudden apparition struck his sight, and set his thoughts in commotion. He saw at some distance among the tents a Capuchin, whom he instantly recognized to be Father Christopher. The history of the good friar, from the moment in which we lost sight of him until this meeting, may be related in a few words. He had not stirred from Rimini, and he would not now have thought of doing so if the plague breaking out at Milan had not afforded him the opportunity, so long desired, of sacrificing his life for the benefit of others. He demanded as a favor permission to go and assist those who were infected with the disease. The Count, he of the secret council, was dead, and moreover at this time there was a greater want of guardians to the sick than of politicians. His request was readily granted. He had now been in the lazzaretto nearly 3 months. But the joy of Renzo at seeing the good father was not unalloyed. It was he indeed, but alas, how changed, how wan! Exhausted nature appeared to be sustained for a while by the mind that had acquired new vigor from the perpetual demand on its sympathies and activity.
"Oh, Father Christopher,"
said Renzo, when he was near enough to speak to him.
"You here?"
said the friar, rising.
"How are you, my father? How are you?"
"Better than these unfortunate beings that you see,"
replied the friar. His voice was feeble, hollow, and changed as his person. His eye alone had not lost its original brightness. Benevolence and charity appeared to have imparted to it a lustre superior to that which bodily weakness was gradually extinguishing.
"But you,"
pursued he,
"why are you here? Why do you thus come to brave the pestilence?"
"I have had it, thank heaven. I come in search of Lucy."
"Lucy? Is Lucy here?"
"Yes, at least I hope so."
"Is she thy wife?"
"My dear father, alas, no, she is not my wife." "Do you know nothing, then, of what has happened?"
"No, my son. Since God removed me from you, I have heard nothing. But now that he sends you to me, I wish much to know. And your banishment."
"You know, then, what they did to me."
"But what did you do?"
"My father, if I were to say I was prudent on that day in Milan, I should tell a falsehood, but I committed no bad action wilfully."
"I believe you. I have always thought so."
"Now then, I will tell you all."
"Wait a moment."
He approached a cabin and called,
"Father Victor."
In a few moments a young Capuchin appeared.
"Do me the favor, Father Victor,"
said he,
"to take my place in watching over our poor patients for a little while. If, however, any should particularly ask for me, be so good as to call me."
The young friar complied, and Father Christopher, turning to Renzo,
"Let us enter here,"
said he.
"But,"
added he,
"you appear much exhausted. You have need of food."
It is true. Now that you make me think of it, I have not tasted anything today.
"Wait, then, a moment."
He soon brought Renzo a bowl of broth from a large kettle, the common property of the establishment, and making him sit down on his bed, the only seat his cabin afforded, and placing some wine on a little table by his side, he seated himself next him.
"Now tell me about my poor child,"
said he,
"and be in haste, for time is precious, and I have much to do, as you perceive."
Renzo related the history of Lucy, that she had been sheltered in the convent of Monza and carried off from her asylum. At the idea of such treatment and peril, and at the thought, too, that it was he who had unwittingly exposed her to it, the good friar was breathless with attention. But he recovered his tranquillity when he heard of her miraculous deliverance, her restoration to her mother, and her having been placed under the protection of Donna Prassede. Renzo then briefly related his journey to Milan, his flight, and his return home, that he had not found Agnes there, and at Milan had learned that Lucy was in the lazzaretto.
"And I am here,"
concluded he,
"I am here in search of her, to see if she yet lives, and if she still thinks of me, because sometimes—"
"But what direction did they give you? Did they tell you where she was placed when she came here?"
"I know nothing, dear father, nothing. Only that she is here, if she still lives, which may God grant."
"Oh, poor child! But what have you done here until now?"
"I have searched and searched, but have seen hardly any but men. I think the females must be in another part by themselves. You can tell me if this is the case?"
"Know you not that it is forbidden to men to enter there, unless their duty calls them?"
"Oh, well, what can happen to me if I should attempt?"
"The law is a good one, my dear son, and if our weight of affliction does not permit us to enforce it, is that a reason why an honest man should infringe it?"
"But, Father Christopher, Lucy should have been my wife. You know how we have been separated. It is 20 months since I have suffered, and taken my misfortunes patiently. I have come here, risking everything to behold her, and now—"
"I know not what to say,"
resumed the friar.
"You are, no doubt, guided by a praiseworthy motive. Would to God that all those who have free access to these places conducted themselves as well as I am sure you will. God, who certainly blesses thy perseverance of affection, thy fidelity in desiring and seeking her whom he has given thee. God, who is more rigorous than man, but also more indulgent, will not regard what may be irregular in this inquiry for one so dear."
So saying, he arose, and Renzo followed him. While listening to him, he had been confirmed in his resolution not to acquaint the father with Lucy's vow.
"If he learns that,"
thought he
will certainly raise new difficulties. Either I shall find her, and we can then disclose, or then what would the use be?"
After conducting him to the opening of the cabin towards the north,
"From yonder little temple,"
said he,
"rising above the miserable tents, Father Felix is about to lead in procession the small remnant who are convalescent to another station to finish their quarantine. Avoid notice, but watch them as they pass. If she is not of the number, this side,"
added he, pointing to the edifice before them,
"this side of the building, and a part of the field before it, are assigned to the women. You will perceive a railing which divides that quarter from this, but so broken in many places that you can easily pass through. Once there, if you do nothing to offend, probably no one will speak to you. If, however, there is any difficulty, say that Father Christopher knows you and will answer for you. Seek her, then, Seek her with confidence, and with resignation, for, remember, it is an unusual expectation, a person alive within the walls of the lazzaretto. Go, then, and be prepared for whatever result.
Yes, I understand,
said Renzo, a dark cloud overshadowing his countenance.
I understand. I will seek in every place, from one end of the lazaretto to the other. And if I do not find her—
If you do not find her,
repeated the father in a serious and admonitory tone. But Renzo, giving vent to the wrath which had been for some time pent up in his bosom, pursued,
If I do not find her, I will find another person, either at Milan, or in his abominable palace, or at the end of the world, or in the house of the devil. I will find the villain who separated us, but for whom Lucy would have been mine 20 months ago. And if we had been destined to die, at least we should have died together. If he still lives, I will find him.
Renzo,
said the friar, seizing him by the arm and looking at him severely.
And if I find him,
continued Renzo, entirely blinded by rage,
if the pestilence has not already done justice, the time is past when a poltroon surrounded by bravos can reduce men to despair and laugh at them. The time is come when men meet face to face, and I will do myself justice.
Unhappy youth,
cried Father Christopher, with a voice which had suddenly become strong and sonorous, his head raised, and eyes darting forth more than their wonted fire.
Unhappy youth, look around you. Behold who punishes and who judges, who punishes and pardons. But you, feeble worm, you would do yourself justice. Do you know what justice is? Unhappy youth, be gone. I hoped that before I died, God would afford me the consolation to learn that my poor Lucy still lived, to see her, perhaps, and to hear her promise that she would send a prayer to yonder grave where I shall rest. Be gone, you have taken away my hope. God has not left her on the earth for thee, and you certainly have not the audacity to believe yourself worthy that God should think of consoling you. Go, I have no time to listen to you farther.
And he dropped the arm of Renzo, which he had grasped, and moved towards the cabin.
Oh, my father,
said Renzo, following him with a supplicating look.
Will you send me away thus?
How?
Resumed the Capuchin, but in a gentler tone.
Would you dare ask me to steal the time from these poor afflicted ones, who are expecting me to speak to them of the pardon of God, in order to listen to thy accents of rage, thy projects of vengeance? I listened to you when you asked consolation and advice, but now that you have revenge in your heart, what do you want with me? Begone! I have listened to the forgiveness of the injured, and the repentance of the aggressor. I have wept with both, but what have I to do with thee?
Oh, I pardon him. I pardon him. I pardon him forever,
said the young man.
Renzo,
said the friar in a calmer tone,
think of it, and tell me how often you have pardoned him.
He kept silence some time, and not receiving an answer, he bowed his head, and with a voice trembling from emotion, continued,
You know why I wear this habit.
Renzo hesitated.
You know it,
repeated the old man.
I know it.
I likewise hated. I, who have reprimanded you for a thought, a word. The man I hated, I killed.
Yes, but it was a noble, one of those—
Silence!
Interrupted the friar.
If that were justification, believe you I should not have found it in 30 years? Ah, if I could now make you experience the sentiment I have since had, and that I now have for the man I hated. If I could, But God can. May He do it. Hear me, Renzo. He is a better friend to you than you are to yourself. You have thought of revenge, but he has power enough, pity enough, to prevent it. You know you have often said that he can arrest the arm of the powerful, but learn also that he can arrest that of the vindictive. And because you are poor, because you are injured, can he not defend against you a man created in his image? Will he suffer you to do all you wish? No. But he can cast you off forever. He can, for this sentiment which animates you, embitter your whole life, since whatever happens to you, hold for certain that all will be punishment until you have pardoned freely and forever.
Yes, yes,
said Renzo with much emotion.
I feel that I have never truly pardoned him. I have spoken as a brute and not as a Christian. And now, by the help of God, I pardon him from the bottom of my soul.
And should you see him,
I would pray God to grant me patience and to touch his heart.
Do you remember that the Lord has not only told us to pardon our enemies, but to love them? Do you remember that he loved them so as to die for them?
Yes, I do.
Well, come and behold him. You have said you would find him. You shall do so. Come, and you will see against whom you preserve hatred, to whom you desire evil, against what life you would arm yourself.
He took the hand of Renzo, who followed him without daring to ask a question. The friar led the way into one of the cabins. The first object Renzo beheld was a sick person seated on a bed of straw who appeared to be convalescent. On seeing the father, he shook his head, as if to say, "No." The father bowed his with an air of sorrow and resignation. Renzo, meanwhile, gazing with uneasy curiosity around the cabin, beheld in the corner of it a sick person lying on a feather bed, wrapped up in a sheet and covered with a cloak. Looking attentively, he recognized Don Roderick. The unfortunate man lay motionless, his eyes wide open, but without any cognizance of the objects around him. The stamp of death was on his face, which was covered with black spots. His lips were swollen and black. You would have thought it the face of the dead if a violent contraction about the mouth had not revealed a tenacity of life. His respiration was painful, and his livid hand, extending on the outside of the covering, was firmly grasping his cloak and pressing it upon his heart, as if conscious that there was his deepest agony.
Behold,
said the friar, in a low, solemn voice,
the sentiment you hold towards this man who has offended you, such will God hold towards you on the great day. Bless him, and be blessed. For 4 days he has been here in this condition without giving any sign of perception. Perhaps the Lord is disposed to grant him an hour of repentance, but he would have you pray for it. Perhaps he desires that you should pray for him with this innocent girl. Perhaps he reserves this favor for thy prayer alone, for the prayer of an afflicted and resigned heart. Perhaps the salvation of this man and thine own depend at this moment upon thyself, upon thy pity, upon thy love.
He kept silence, and clasping his hands, bowed his head as in prayer, and Renzo, completely subdued, followed his example. Their supplications were interrupted in a short time by the striking of a bell. They immediately arose and left the cabin.
The procession is about to move,
said the father.
Go then, prepared to make a sacrifice, to praise God, whatever may be the issue of your search. And whatever that may be, return to me, and we will praise him together.
Here they separated, the one to resume his painful duties, the other to the little temple, which was close at hand. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, translated by George William Fenshaw. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 35. Who would have told Renzo some moments before that at the very time of his greatest suspense and anxiety his heart should be divided between Lucy and Don Roderick? And nevertheless it was so. The thought of him mingled itself with all the bright and painful images which hope or fear called up as he proceeded. The words the friar had uttered by that bed of pain blended themselves with the cruel uncertainty of his soul. He could not utter a prayer for the happy issue of his present undertaking without adding to it one for the miserable object of his former resentment and revenge. He saw the Father Felix on the portico of the church, and by his attitude comprehended that the holy man was addressing the assembled convalescents. He placed himself where he could overlook the audience. In the midst were the women, covered with veils. Renzo gazed at them intently, but finding that, from the place where he stood, it would be a vain scrutiny, he directed his attention to the Father. He was touched by his venerable figure, and listened with all the attention his own solicitude would allow to the reverend speaker, who thus proceeded in his affecting address.
"Let us think for a moment,"
said he,
"of the thousands who have gone forth thither,"
pointing to a gate behind him leading to the burying ground of St. Gregory, which was then but one mighty grave.
"Let us look at the thousands who remain here, uncertain of their destiny. Let us also look at ourselves. May the Lord be praised, praised in his justice, praised in his mercy, praised in death, praised in life, praised in the choice he has made of us. Oh, why has he done it, my children, if not to preserve a people, corrected by affliction and animated by gratitude, that we may be deeply sensible that life is his gift, that we may value it accordingly, and employ it in works which he will approve, that the remembrance of our sufferings may render us compassionate and actively benevolent to others. May those with whom we have suffered, hoped and feared, and among whom we leave friends and kindred, may they, as we pass amidst them, derive edification from our deportment. May God preserve us from any exhibition of self-congratulation or carnal joy at escaping that death against which they are still struggling. May they see us depart, rendering thanks to heaven for ourselves, and praying for them, that they may say, even beyond these walls they will remember us, they will continue to pray for us. Let us begin from this moment, from the first step we shall take into the world, a life of charity. Let those who have regained their former strength lend a fraternal arm to the feeble. Let the young sustain the old. Let those who are left without children become parents to the orphan, and thus your sorrows will be softened, and your lives will be acceptable to God."
Here a deep murmur of sighs and sobs, which had been increasing in the assembly, was suddenly suspended, on seeing the friar place a cord around his neck and fall on his knees. All was intense attention and profound silence.
"For myself,"
said he,
"and for all my companions, who have been chosen to the high privilege of serving Christ in you, I humbly ask your forgiveness if we have not worthily fulfilled so great a ministry, if indolence or the waywardness of the flesh has rendered us less attentive to your wants, less prompt to your call than duty demanded, if unjust impatience or culpable disgust have caused us sometimes to appear severe and wearied in your presence, if indeed the miserable thought that you had need of us has led us to be deficient in humility toward you, if our frailty has made us commit any action which may have given you pain, pardon us. May God remit also your offences and bless you."
We have here related, if not the very words, at least the sense of that which he uttered, but we cannot describe the accent which accompanied them. It was that of a man who called it a privilege to serve the afflicted, because he really considered it such, who confessed not to have worthily exercised this privilege, because he truly felt his deficiency, who asked pardon, because he was persuaded he had need of it, but his hearers, who had beheld these Capuchins only occupied in serving them, who had beheld so many of them die in the service, and he who now spoke in the name of all, always the first in toil, as he was the first in authority, his hearers could only answer him with tears. The good friar then took a cross which rested against a pillar, and holding it up before him, took off his sandals, passing through the crowd, which opened respectfully to give him a passage, and placed himself at their head. Renzo, overcome with emotion, drew on one side and placed himself near a cabin, where, half concealed, he awaited with his eyes open, his heart palpitating, but with renewed confidence, the result of the emotion excited by the touching scene of which he had been a witness. Father Felix proceeded barefooted at the head of the procession, with the cord about his neck, bearing that long and heavy cross. He advanced slowly but resolutely, as one who would spare the weakness of others, but whose ideas of duty enabled him to rise above his own. The largest children followed immediately behind him, for the most part barefooted, and very few entirely clothed. Then came the women, nearly all of them leading a child, and singing alternately the Miserere. The feeble sound of the voices, the paleness and languor of the countenances, would have excited commiseration in the heart of a mere spectator, but Renzo was occupied with his own peculiar anxieties. The slow progress of the procession enabled him to scan with ease every face as it passed. He looked and looked again, and always in vain. His eye wandered from rank to rank, from face to face. They came, they passed. In vain, in vain! None but unknown features. A new ray of hope dawned upon his mind as he beheld some cars approaching, in which were the convalescents who were still too feeble to support the fatigue of walking. They approached so slowly that Renzo had full leisure to examine each in turn, but he was again disappointed. The cars had all passed, and Father Michael, with his staff in his hand, brought up the rear as regulator of the procession. Thus nearly vanished his hopes, and with them his resolution. His only ground of hope now was to find Lucy still under the power of the disease. To this sad and feeble hope he clung with all the ardor of his nature. He fell on his knees at the last step of the temple, and breathed forth an unconnected but fervent prayer. He arose, strengthened in hope, and passing the railing pointed out by the father, entered into the quarter allotted to the women. As he entered it, he saw on the ground one of the little bells that the Monati carried on their feet, with its leather straps attached to it. Thinking it might serve him as a passport, he tied it to his foot, and then began his painful search. Here new scenes of sorrow met his eye, similar in part to those he had already witnessed, partly dissimilar. Under the weight of the same calamity, he discerned a more patient endurance of pain, and a greater sensibility to the afflictions of others. They to whom bodily suffering is a lot and an inheritance acquire from it fortitude to bear their own woes, and sympathy to bestow on the woes of others. Renzo had proceeded some distance on his search, when he heard behind him a "Ho!" which appeared to be addressed to him. Turning, he saw at a distance a commissary, who cried,
"Go there into these rooms. They want you there. They have not finished carrying all off."
Renzo perceived that he took him for a Monato, and that the little bell had caused the mistake. He determined to extricate himself from it as soon as he could. Making a sign of obedience, he hid himself from the commissary by passing between two cabins which were very near each other. As he stooped to unloose the strap of the little bell, he rested his head against the straw wall of one of the cabins. A voice reached his ear. Oh, heaven, is it possible? His whole soul was in his ear. He scarcely breathed. Yes, it was that voice.
"Fear of what?"
said that gentle voice.
"We have passed through worse dangers than a tempest. He who has watched over us until now will still continue to do so."
Renzo scarcely breathed. His knees trembled. His sight became dim. With a great effort recovering his faculties, he went to the door of the cabin and beheld her who had spoken. She was standing, leaning over a bed. She turned at the sound of his steps, and gazed for a moment bewildered. At last she exclaimed,
"Oh, blessed Lord!"
"Lucy, I have found you again. I have found you again. It is indeed you. You live,"
cried Renzo, advancing with trembling steps.
"Oh, blessed Lord!"
cried Lucy, greatly agitated.
"Is it indeed you? How? Why? The pestilence!"
"I have had it, and you?"
"Yes, I have had it also. And my mother?"
"I have not seen her yet. She is at Pasturo. I believe, however, that she is well. But you are still suffering. How feeble you appear. You are cured, however. You are, is it not so?"
"The Lord has seen fit to leave me a little longer here below,"
said Lucy.
"But, Renzo, why are you here?"
"Why?"
said Renzo, approaching her.
"Do you ask me why I am here? Must I tell you? Whom do I think of then? Am I not Renzo? Are you no longer Lucy?"
"Oh, why speak thus? Did not my mother write to you?"
"Yes, she wrote to me. Kind things, truly, to write to a poor unfortunate man, an exile from his native land, one at least who never injured you.
But Renzo, since you knew, why come? Why?
Why come? Oh, Lucy, why come, do you say? After so many promises, are we no longer the same? Is all forgotten?
Oh, God,
cried Lucy, sorrowfully clasping her hands and raising her eyes to heaven.
Why didst thou not take me to thyself? Oh, Renzo, what have you done? Alas, I hoped that with time I should have driven from my memory.
A kind hope indeed, and to say so to me.
Oh, what have you done? In this place, in the midst of these sorrows, here, where there is nothing but death, you have dared.
We must pray to God for those who die, and trust that they will be happy. But their calamity is no reason why those who live must live in despair.
But Renzo, you know not what you say. A promise to the Virgin, a vow.
I tell you, such promises are good for nothing.
Oh, where have you been all this time? With whom have you associated that you speak thus?
I speak as a good Christian. I think better of the Virgin than you do, because I do not believe vows to the injury of others are acceptable to her. If the Virgin had spoken herself, oh, then indeed, but it is simply an idea of your own.
No, you know not what you say. You know not what it is to make a vow. Leave me for the love of heaven.
Lucy,
said Renzo,
tell me at least, if this reason did not exist, would you feel the same towards me?
Unfeeling man,
said Lucy, with difficulty restraining her tears.
Would it satisfy you to hear me confess that which might be sinful and would certainly be useless? Leave me, forget me. We were not destined for each other. We shall meet again above. We have not long to remain in the world. Go, tell my mother that I am cured, that even here God has assisted me, that I have found a good soul, this worthy woman who has been a mother to me. Tell her we shall meet when it is the will of God, and as it is his will. Go, for the love of heaven, and remember me no more, except when you pray to God.
And as if wishing to withdraw from the temptation to prolong the conversation, she drew near the bed where the female was lying of whom she had spoken.
Hear me, Lucy, hear me,
said Renzo, without, however, approaching her.
No, go away, for charity.
Hear me, Father Christopher.
How?
He is here.
Here? Where? How do you know?
I have just spoken with him. A man like him, it appears to me.
He is here, to assist the afflicted, no doubt. Has he had the plague?
Lucy, I greatly fear.
As Renzo hesitated to utter his fears, she had unconsciously again approached him with a look of anxious enquiry.
I fear he has it now.
Oh, poor man! But what do I say, poor man? He is rich in the favor of God. How is he? Is he confined to his bed? Has he assistance?
He is, on the contrary, still assisting others. But if you were to see him, alas, there can be no mistake.
Oh, is he indeed within these walls?
Said Lucy.
Here and not far off, hardly farther than from your cottage to mine, if you remember.
O most holy Virgin!
Shall I tell you what he said to me? He said I did well to come in search of you, that God would approve it, and that he would assist me to find you. Thus, then, you see.
If he spoke thus, it was because he did not know.
What use would there be in his knowing a mere imagination of your own? A man of sense, such as he is, never thinks of things of that sort. But, oh, Lucy, shall I tell you what I have seen?
And he related his visit to the cabin. Lucy, although familiarized in this abode of horrors to spectacles of wretchedness and despair, was shocked at the recital.
And at the sight of that bed,
said Renzo,
if you could have heard the holy man. He said that God has perhaps resolved to look in mercy on this unfortunate, I can now give him no other name, that he designs to subdue him to himself, and that he desires that we should pray together for him. Together. Do you understand?
Yes, yes, we will pray each, there where the Lord shall place us. He can unite our prayers.
But if I tell you his very words...
But Renzo, he does not know.
But can you not comprehend? When such a man speaks, it is God who speaks in him, and that he would not have spoken thus if it ought not to be exactly so. And the soul of this unfortunate, I have prayed and will pray for him. I have prayed with all my heart, as if he were my brother. But what, think you, will be his condition in the other world, if we do not repair some of the evil he has done? If you return to reason, all will be set in order. That which has been, has been. He has had his punishment here below.
No, Renzo, no. God would not have us do evil that good may come. Leave to him the care of this unfortunate man. Our duty is to pray for him. If I had died that fatal night, would not God have been able to pardon him? And if I am not dead, if I have been delivered...
And your mother, poor Agnes, who desired so much to see us man and wife, has she not told you it was a foolish imagination?
My mother? Think you my mother would advise me to break a vow? Would you desire that she should? But Renzo, you are not in your right mind.
Oh, you women cannot be made to comprehend reason. Father Christopher told me to return, and to inform him whether I had found you. I will go and get his advice.
Yes, yes, go to the holy man. Tell him I pray for him, and that I desire his prayers. But for the love of heaven, for your soul's sake and for mine, do not return here, to tempt me. Father Christopher will explain matters to you, and make you return to yourself. He will set your heart at rest.
My heart at rest? Oh, don't encourage an idea of that sort. You have before now caused such language to be written to me, and the suffering it caused me. And now you have the heart to tell it to me? As for me, I declare to you plainly that I will never set my heart at rest, Lucy. You have told me to forget you. Forget you. How can I do that, after so many trials, so many promises? Who have I thought of ever since we parted? It is because I have suffered that you treat me thus? Because I have been unfortunate? Because the world has persecuted me? Because I have been so long away from you? Because the first moment I was able, I came to seek you.
O Holy Virgin!
Exclaimed Lucy, as the tears flowed from her eyes.
Come to my help. You have aided me hitherto, aid me now. Since that night, such a moment as this have I never passed.
Yes, Lucy, you do well to invoke the Virgin. She is the mother of compassion, and will take no pleasure in our sufferings. But if this is an excuse, if I have become odious to you, tell me, speak frankly.
For pity, Renzo, for pity, stop. Stop. Do not make me die. Go to Father Christopher, commend me to him. Do not return here. Do not return here.
I go, but think not I will not return. I would return from the end of the world. Yes, I would return.
And he disappeared. Lucy threw herself on the floor near the bed, upon which she rested her head and wept bitterly. The good woman, who had been a silent spectator of the painful scene, demanded the cause of her anguish and tears. But perhaps the reader will wish to know something of this benevolent person. We will satisfy the desire in a few words. She was a rich tradeswoman, about 30 years of age. She had beheld her husband and children die of the plague. Attacked by it herself, she had been brought to the lazzaretto and placed in the cabin with Lucy, who was just beginning to recover her senses, which had forsaken her from the commencement of her attack, in the house of Don Ferrante. The humble roof could only accommodate 2 guests, and there grew up, in their affliction, a strict and intimate friendship between them. They derived great consolation from each other's society, and had pledged themselves not to separate after quitting the lazzaretto. The good woman, whose wealth was now far more ample than were her wishes, wished to retain Lucy with her as a daughter. The proposition was received with gratitude and accepted, on condition of the permission and approval of Agnes. Lucy had, however, never made known to her the circumstances of her intended marriage, and her other extraordinary adventures. But now she related, as distinctly as tears permitted her to do so, her sad story. Meanwhile, Renzo went in search of Father Christopher. He found him with no small difficulty, and engaged in administering consolation to a dying man. The scene was soon closed. The father remained a short time in silent prayer. He then arose, and seeing Renzo approach, exclaimed,
"Well, my son."
"She is there. I have found her."
"In what state?"
"Convalescent and out of danger."
"God be praised,"
said the friar.
"But,"
said Renzo,
"there is another difficulty."
"What do you mean?"
"I mean that you know how good this poor girl is, but she is sometimes a little fanciful. After so many promises, she tells me now she cannot marry me, because on that night of fear she made a vow to the Virgin. These things signify nothing, do they? Is it not true that they are not binding, at least on people such as we are?"
"Is she far from this?"
"Oh no, a few steps beyond the church."
"Wait a moment,"
said the friar,
"and we will go together."
"Will you give her to understand that—"
"I know not, my son. I must hear what she will say."
And they proceeded to Lucy's cabin. The clouds were gathering in the heavens, and a tempest coming on. Rapid lightning, cleaving the increasing darkness, illumined at moments the long roofs and arcades of the building, and the cupola of the little church. Loud claps of thunder resounded with prolonged echoes through the heavens. Renzo suppressed his impatience and accommodated his steps to the strength of the father, who, exhausted by fatigue, oppressed by disease, and breathing in pain, could with difficulty drag his failing limbs to the performance of this last act of benevolence. As they reached the door of the cabin, Renzo stopped, saying in a trembling voice,
"She is there."
They entered. Lucy arose, and ran towards the old man, crying,
"Oh, what do I see? Father Christopher!"
"Well, Lucy, through how much peril has God preserved you! You must be rejoiced that you have always trusted in Him."
"Ah, yes. But you, my father, how you are changed! How do you feel? Say, how are you?"
"As God wills, and as, through His grace, I will also,"
replied the friar with a serene countenance. Drawing her aside, he said,
"Hear me. I have but a few moments to spare. Are you disposed to confide in me, as in times past?"
"Oh, are you not still my father?"
"Well, my child, what is this vow of which Renzo speaks?"
"It is a vow I made to the Virgin never to marry."
"But did you forget that you were bound by a previous promise? God, my daughter, accepts of offerings from that which is our own. It is the heart He desires, the will, but you cannot offer the will of another to whom you had pledged yourself."
"I have done wrong."
"No, poor child, think not so. I believe the Holy Virgin has accepted the intention of your afflicted heart, and has offered it to God for you. But tell me, did you ask the advice of anyone about this matter?"
"I did not deem it a sin, or I would have confessed it, and the little good one does, one ought not to mention."
"Have you no other motive for preventing the fulfillment of your promise to Renzo?"
"As to that, for myself, what motive? No other,"
replied Lucy, with a hesitation which implied anything rather than uncertainty, and a blush passed over her pale and lovely countenance.
"Do you believe,"
resumed the old man,
"that God has given the Church authority to remit the obligations that man may have contracted to Him?"
"Yes, I believe it."
"Learn, then, that the care of souls in this place being committed to us, we have the most ample powers from the Church, and I can, if you ask it, free you from the obligation you have contracted by this vow."
"But is it not a sin to repent of a promise made to the Virgin?"
said Lucy, violently agitated by unexpected hope.
"Sin, my child,"
said the father.
"Sin to recur to the Church, and to ask her minister to use the authority which he has received from her, and which she receives from God. I bless Him that He has given me, unworthy that I am, the power to speak in his name, and to restore to you your vow. If you ask me to absolve you from it, I shall not hesitate to do so, and I even hope you will.
Then I ask it,
said Lucy with a modest confidence. The friar beckoned to Renzo, who was watching the progress of the dialogue with the deepest solicitude, to approach, and said aloud to Lucy,
With the authority I hold from the Church, I declare you absolved from your vow, and liberate you from all the obligations you may have contracted by it.
The reader may imagine the feelings of Renzo at these words. His eyes expressed the warmth of his gratitude to him who had uttered them, but they sought in vain for Lucy's.
Return in peace and safety to your former attachment,
said the father.
And do you remember, my son, that in giving you this companion, the Church does it not to ensure simply your temporal happiness, but to prepare you both for happiness without end. Thank Heaven that you have been brought to this state through misery and affliction. Your joy will be the more temperate and durable. If God should grant you children, bring them up in His fear and in love to all men. For the rest, you cannot greatly err. And now, Lucy, has Renzo told you whom he has beheld in this place?
Yes, father, he has told me.
You will pray for him, and for me also, my children. You will remember your poor friar.
And drawing from his basket a small wooden box.
Within this box are the remains of the loaf. The first I asked for charity, the loaf of which you have heard. I leave it to you. Show it to your children. They will come into a wicked world. They will meet the proud and insolent. Tell them always to forgive. Always. Everything. Everything. And let them pray for the poor friar.
Lucy took the box from his hands with a reverence, and he continued,
Now tell me what you mean to do here at Milan, and who will conduct you to your mother?
This good lady has been a mother to me,
said Lucy.
We shall leave this place together, and she will provide for all.
May God bless her,
said the friar, approaching the bed.
May he bestow his blessings upon you,
said the widow.
For the joy you have given to the afflicted, although it disappoints my hope of having Lucy as a companion. But I will accompany her to her village and restore her to her mother, and
added she in a low voice,
I will give the outfit. I have much wealth, and of those who should have enjoyed it with me, none are left.
The service will be acceptable to God,
said the father,
who has watched over you both in affliction. Now,
added he, turning to Renzo,
we must be gone. I have remained too long already.
Oh, my father,
said Lucy,
shall I see you again? I have recovered from this dreadful disease, I who am of no use in the world, and you—
It is long since,
replied the old man with a serious and gentle tone.
I asked a great favor from heaven, that of ending my days in the service of my fellow men. If God grants it to me now, all those who love me should help me to return him thanks. And now give Renzo your commissions for your mother.
Tell her all,
said Lucy to her betrothed.
Tell her I have found here another mother, and that we will come to her as soon as we possibly can.
If you have need of money,
said Renzo,
I have here all that you sent.
No,
said the widow.
I have more than sufficient.
Farewell, Lucy, and you too, good Signora, till we meet again,
said Renzo, not having words to express his feelings at this moment.
Who knows whether we shall all meet again?
cried Lucy.
May God ever watch over you and bless you,
said the friar as he quitted the cabin with Renzo. As night was not far distant, the Capuchin offered the young man a shelter in his humble abode.
I cannot bear you company,
said he,
but you can at least repose yourself in order to be able to prosecute your journey.
Renzo, however, felt impatient to be gone. As to the hour or the weather, It might be said that, night or day, rain or shine, heat or cold, were equally indifferent to him. The friar pressed his hand as he departed, saying,
"If you find, which may God grant, the good Agnes, remember me to her. Tell her, as well as all those who remember Friar Christopher, to pray for me."
Oh, dear Father, shall we never meet again?
Above, I hope. Farewell, farewell.
End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, translated by George William Fenshaw. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 36. As Renzo passed without the walls of the lazzaretto, the rain began to fall in torrents. Instead of lamenting, he rejoiced at it. He was delighted with the refreshing air, and with the sound of the falling drops from the plants and foliage, which seemed to have new life imparted to them. And breathing more freely in this change of nature, he felt more vividly the change that had occurred in his own destiny. But much would his enjoyment have been increased could he have surmised what would be seen a few days after. This water carried off, washed away, so to speak, the contagion. If the lazzaretto did not restore to the living all the living it still contained, at least from that day it received no more into its vast abyss. At the end of a week, shops were opened. People returned to their houses. Quarantine was hardly spoken of, and there remained of the pestilence but a few scattered traces. Our traveller proceeded on full of joy, without having thought where or when he should stop for the night, anxious only to go forward to reach the village, and to proceed immediately to Pasturo in search of Agnes. In the midst of the reminiscences and of the horrors and the dangers of the day, there was always present the thought,
"I have found her. She is well. She is mine."
And then again he recalled his doubts, his difficulties, his fears, his hopes that had agitated him that eventful morning. He fancied himself with his hand on the knocker of Don Ferrante's house, and the unfavourable answer, and then those fools who were about to attack him in their madness, and the lazzaretto, that vast sepulchre. To have hurried thither to find her, and to have found her. And the procession! What a moment! And now it appeared nothing to him, and the quarter set apart for the women, and there behind that cabin, when he least expected it, that voice itself, and to see her there. But then her vow, it exists no longer, and his violent hatred against Don Roderick, which had augmented his grief, and shed its venom over his hopes, that also was gone. Indeed, had it not been for his uncertainty concerning Agnes, his anxiety about Father Christopher, and the consciousness that the pestilence still existed, his happiness would have been without alloy. He arrived at Sesto in the evening. The rain had as yet no appearance of ceasing, but Renzo did not stop. His only inconvenience was an extraordinary appetite, which the vicinity of a baker's shop enabled him to mitigate the violence of. When he passed through Monza, it was a dark night. He succeeded, however, in leaving it by the right road. But what a road! Buried between two banks, almost like the bed of a river. It might then indeed have been called a river, or rather an aqueduct. In numerous places were deep holes, from which Renzo could with difficulty extricate himself. But he did as well as he could without impatience or regret. He reflected that every step brought him nearer to the end of his journey, that the rain would cease when God should please, that day would come in its own time, and that in the meantime the road he had passed over he should not have to travel again. At the break of day he found himself near the Adda. It had not ceased raining. There was still a drizzling shower. The light of the dawn enabled Renzo to see around him. He was in his own country. Who can express his sensations? Those mountains, the Resegone, the territory of Lecco, appeared to belong to him, to be his own. But, looking at his heart, his clothes were wet and clinging to his body, his hat bent out of shape and full of water, his hair hanging straight about his face, while his lower man was encased in a dense covering of mud. He reached Pescate, travelling along the Adda, giving a melancholy glance at Pescarenico, passed the bridge and crossed the fields, to the house of his friend, who, just risen, was at the door looking out upon the weather. He beheld the strange figure covered with mud, and wet to the skin, and yet so joyous and animated. In his life he had never seen a man so accoutred appear so satisfied with himself.
"How?"
said he.
"Already here? And in such weather? How have things gone with you?"
"She is there, she is there, she is there."
"Well and safe?"
"Convalescent, which is better. I have wonderful things to tell you."
"But what a state you are in!"
"A pretty pickle indeed."
In truth, you might squeeze water enough from your upper half to wash away the mud from the lower. But wait a moment. I will make a fire.
I shall be glad to feel its warmth, I assure you. Do you know where the rain overtook me? Precisely at the door of the lazaretto. But no matter, the weather does its business, and I mine.
His friend soon kindled a bright blaze.
Now do me another favor,
said Renzo.
Bring me the bundle I left above, for before my clothes dry.
Returning with the bundle, his friend said,
You must be hungry. You have had drink enough, no doubt, on the way, but as to eating...
I bought 2 loaves yesterday at dusk, but truly I have not eaten them.
Well, I will provide for you.
He poured some water in a kettle which hung over the fire, adding,
I will go and milk the cow, and when I return with the milk, the water will be ready, and we will have a good polenta. You, in the meanwhile, change your clothes.
After having allowed him time to perform the troublesome operation, his friend returned and commenced making the polenta.
I have much to tell you,
said Renzo.
If you were to see Milan and the lazaretto, she is there. You will soon see her here. She will be my wife. You shall be at the wedding, and, pestilence or not, we will be happy for a few hours.
On the following morning Renzo set out for Pasturo. On his arrival he asked concerning Agnes, and learnt that she was in health and safety. He approached her residence, which had been pointed out to him, and called her by name from the street. At the sound of his voice, she rushed to the window, and Renzo, without allowing her time to speak, cried,
Lucy is well. I saw her the day before yesterday. She will be at home shortly. Oh, I have so many things to tell you.
Overcome by various emotions, Agnes could only articulate,
I will open the door for you.
Stop,
said Renzo.
You have not had the plague, I believe.
No. Have you?
Yes, but you ought to be prudent. I come from Milan, and have been for 2 days in the midst of it. It is true I have changed my clothes, but the contagion attaches itself to the flesh like witchcraft. And since God has preserved you until now, you must take care of yourself until all danger is over, for you are our mother, and I trust we shall live long together, as a compensation for the sufferings we have endured. I, at least.
But...
There is no longer any but. I know what you would say. You will soon see there is no longer any but. Come into the open air, where I may speak to you in safety, and I will tell you all about it.
Agnes pointed to a garden adjoining the house. Renzo entered it, and was immediately joined by the anxious and impatient Agnes. They seated themselves opposite each other on 2 benches. The events he described are already known to our reader, and we will leave to his imagination the numerous exclamations of grief, horror, surprise, and joy that interrupted the progress of the narrative every moment. The result, however, was an agreement to settle all together at Bergamo, where Renzo had already an advantageous engagement. When would depend on the pestilence and other circumstances. Agnes was to remain where she was until it should be safe for her to return home, and in the interval she should have regular information of all their movements. He departed with the additional consolation of having found one so dear to him safe and well. He remained the rest of that day and the following night with his friend, and on the morrow set out for the country of his adoption. He found Bortolo in good health, and in less apprehension of losing it, as within a few days things had rapidly changed for the better. The malignity of the distemper had subsided, and given place to fever indeed, accompanied with tumours, but much more easily cured. The country presented a new aspect. Those who had survived the pestilence began to resume their business. Masters were preparing for the employment of workmen in every trade, and above all in that of weaving silk. Renzo made some preparations for the accommodation of his family by purchasing and furnishing a neat little cottage from his hitherto untouched treasure, which the ravages of the plague enabled him to do at small cost. After a few days' stay, he returned by way of Pasturo, and conducted Agnes to her village home. We will not attempt to describe her feelings at beholding again those well-remembered places. She found all things in her cottage as she had left them. It seemed as if angels had watched over the poor widow and her child. Her first care was to get ready with all speed an apartment in her humble abode for that kind friend who had been to her child a second mother. Renzo, on his side, was not idle. He laboured alternately at the widow's garden and in the service of his hospitable friend. As to his own cottage, it pained him to witness the scene of desolation it presented, and he resolved to dispose of it and transfer its value to his new country. His reappearance in the village was a cause of much congratulation to those who had survived the plague. All were anxious to learn his adventures, which had given rise to so many reports among the neighbours. As to Don Abbondio, he exhibited the same apprehension of the marriage as before, the mention of which conjured up to his affrighted fancy the dreaded Don Roderick and his train on the one side, and the almost equally feared Cardinal and his arguments on the other. We will now transport the reader for a few moments to Milan. Some days after the visit of Renzo to the lazzaretto, Lucy left it with the good widow. A general quarantine having been ordered, they passed the period of it together in the house of the latter. The time was employed in preparing Lucy's wedding clothes, and, the quarantine terminated, they set off on their journey. We could add, they arrived, but, notwithstanding our desire to yield to the impatience of the reader, there are 3 circumstances which we must not pass over in silence. The first is, that while Lucy was relating her adventures more minutely to the good widow, she recurred to the Signora who had afforded her an asylum in the convent of Monza, and in return learnt many things which afforded her the solution to numerous mysteries, and filled her with sorrow and astonishment. She learnt, too, that the unfortunate Signora, falling afterwards under the most horrible suspicions, had been, by order of the Cardinal, transferred to a convent at Milan, that there, after having given herself up for a time to rage and despair, she had at last made her confession and repented of her crimes, and that her present life was one of severe and voluntary penance. If anyone desires to know the details of her sad history, it will be found in the author we have so often quoted. The second is, that Lucy, making enquiries concerning Father Christopher, of every Capuchin from the lazzaretto, learnt with more grief than surprise that he had died of the pestilence. And the third is, that before quitting Milan, Lucy had a desire to know something concerning her former patrons. The widow accompanied her to their house, where they were informed that both had died of the plague. When we say of Donna Prassede, she died, we have said all that is necessary. Not so with Don Ferrante. He deserves a little more of our attention, considering his learning. From the commencement of the pestilence, Don Ferrante was one of the most resolute in denying its existence, not indeed like the multitude with cries of rage, but with arguments which none could accuse of want of concatenation.
In rerum natura,
said he,
there are but 2 kinds of things, substances and accidents, and if I prove that the contagion can neither be one nor the other of these, I shall have proved that it does not exist, that it is a chimera. Thus, then, substances are either material or spiritual. That the contagion is a spiritual substance is so absurd an opinion that no one would presume to advance it. It is, then, useless to speak of it. Material substances are either simple or compound. Now, the contagion is not a simple substance, and I will prove it in 3 words. It is not an aerial substance, because, if it were, instead of passing from one body to another, it would fly off to its sphere. It is not a watery substance, because it would be dried up by the wind. It is not igneous, because it would burn. It is not earthy, because it would be visible. Moreover, it is not a compound substance, because it would be sensible to the eye or to the touch, and who has seen it or touched it? It remains to see if it be an accident. This is still less probable. The doctors say it is communicated from body to body. This is their Achilles, the pretext for so many useless regulations. Now, supposing it an accident, it would be a transferable accident, which is an incongruity. There is not in all philosophy a more evident thing than this, that an accident cannot pass from one subject to another. So if, to avoid this Scylla, they are reduced to call it an accident produced, they avoid Scylla by falling into Charybdis, because if it be produced, it is not communicate itself, it does not propagate, as they declare. These principles allowed, what is the use of talking of botches and carbuncles?
It is folly,
said one of his hearers.
No, no,
resumed Don Ferrante.
I do not say so. Science is science. We must only know how to employ it. Swellings, purple botches, and black carbuncles are respectable terms, which have a good and proper signification. But I say they have nothing to do with the question. Who denies that there may be and are such things? We must only prove whence they come.
Here began the vexations of Don Ferrante. So long as he laughed at the contagion, he found respectful and attentive listeners. But when he came to distinguish and demonstrate that the error of the doctors was not in affirming that there existed a general and terrible disease, but rather in assigning its cause, then he found them intractable and rebellious. Then he no longer dared expose his doctrine, but by shreds and patches.
Here is the true reason,
said he.
And those even who maintain other fancies are obliged to acknowledge it. Let them deny, if they can, that there is a fatal conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And when has it been said that influences propagate? And would these gentlemen deny the existence of influences? Will they say there are no planets? Or will they say that they keep up above, doing nothing, as so many pins in a pincushion? But that which I cannot understand from these doctors is, that they confess we are under so malign a conjunction, and then they tell us, don't touch this, don't touch that, and you will be safe. As if, in avoiding the material contact of terrestrial bodies, we could prevent the virtual effect of celestial bodies. And such a work in burning rags! Poor people! Will you burn Jupiter? Will you burn Saturn?
His fretus, that is to say, on these grounds, he took no precautions against the pestilence. He caught it and died, like Metastasio's hero, complaining of the stars. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, translated by George William Fenshaw. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 37. One fine evening, Agnes heard a carriage drive up to the door of her cottage. It was Lucy and the good widow. We can easily imagine the joy of the meeting. The following morning Renzo made his appearance at an early hour, little expecting to find Lucy with her mother.
"How are you, Renzo?"
said Lucy with downcast eyes, and in a tone, oh, how different from that which she addressed all besides. Renzo was conscious that it was meant for him alone.
"I am always well when I see you,"
replied the young man.
"Our poor Father Christopher,"
said Lucy.
"Pray for his soul, although we may be almost sure he is now in heaven, praying for us."
"I expected no less,"
said Renzo mournfully.
"I expected to hear that he was taken away from this world of sorrow and trouble."
Notwithstanding the sadness of their recollections, joy was the predominant feeling of their hearts. The good widow was an agreeable addition to the little company. When Renzo saw her in the miserable cabin at the lazzaretto, he could not have believed her to be of so facile and gay a disposition. But the lazzaretto and the country, death and a wedding, are not at all the same things. During the evening Renzo left them for the purpose of visiting the curate.
"Signor Curate,"
said he, with a respectful but jocular air,
"the headache, which you said prevented you from marrying us, has it passed off? The bride is here, and I am come to have you appoint an hour. But I pray you, not to let it be far distant."
Don Abbondio did not say he would not, but he began to offer excuses and insinuations.
Why come forward into public view with this order for his apprehension hanging over him? And the thing could be easily done elsewhere.
And then this, and then that.
"I understand,"
said Renzo.
"You have still a little pain in your head, but listen to me."
And he described the state in which he had seen Don Roderick.
"That has nothing to do with us,"
said Don Abbondio.
"Did I say no to you? However, while there is life, there is hope, you know. Look at me. I have also been nearer the other world than this, and here I am nevertheless. And if new troubles do not fall upon me, I hope to remain here a little longer."
The conversation was prolonged some time, without coming to any satisfactory conclusion, and Renzo returned home to relate it.
"I came off,"
said he,
"because I feared I should lose all patience. At times he behaved exactly as he did before, and I verily believe if I had remained a little longer, he would have spoken Latin again. I see that all this portends a tedious business. It would be better to do as he says, and go and be married where we intend to live."
"Let us go and see what we can do,"
said the widow.
"Perhaps he will be more tractable to the ladies."
They followed this advice, and in the afternoon proceeded to the parsonage. The curate evinced much pleasure on seeing Lucy and Agnes, and much politeness towards the stranger. He endeavoured to divert the discourse from that which he knew to be the purport of their visit. He begged from Lucy a recital of all her woes, and availed himself of the account of the lazzaretto to draw the stranger into the conversation. He then expatiated on his own miseries, which he detailed at full length. The pause so long watched for came at last. One of the widows broke the ice, but Don Abbondio was no longer the same man. He did not say no, but he returned to his doubts and his difficulties, jumping like a bird from branch to branch.
"It would be necessary,"
said he,
"to get free from this unlucky order. You, Signora, who live at Milan, you ought to know the course of these things. If we had the protection of some powerful man, all wounds would be healed. After all, the shortest way would be to have the ceremony performed where these young people are going, and where this proscription cannot affect them. Here, with this order, which is known to everyone, to utter from the altar the name of Lorenzo Tramaglino is a thing I should be very unwilling to do. I wish him too well. It would be rendering him an ill service."
While Agnes and the widow were endeavouring to reply to these reasons, which the subtle curate has often reproduced under another form, Renzo entered the room with the air of one bringing important intelligence.
"The Lord Marquis has arrived,"
said he.
"What do you mean? Arrived? Where?"
said Don Abbondio, rising.
"He has arrived at his castle, which was Don Roderick's. He is the heir by fulfilment of trust, as they say, so that there is no longer a doubt on the subject. And as to the Marquis, he is a most worthy man."
"That he is,"
said Don Abbondio.
"I have often heard him spoken of as an excellent lord. But is it really true that—"
"Will you believe your sexton?"
"Why?"
"Because he saw him with his own eyes. Will you hear Ambrose? I made him wait without expressly."
Renzo called the sexton, who confirmed the intelligence.
"Ah, is he dead then? He is really gone?"
said Don Abbondio.
"You see, my children, the hand of Providence. It is a happy thing for this poor country. We could not live with this man. The plague has been a great scourge, but it has also been, as it were, a serviceable broom. It has swept off certain people, of whom, my children, we could never have delivered ourselves. In the twinkling of an eye they have disappeared by the 100. We shall no longer see him wandering about with that haughty air, followed by his cutthroats, and looking at everybody as if they were all placed on earth for his pleasure. He is gone, and we are still here. He will send no more messages to honest people. He has made us all pass a sad life, and now we are at liberty to say so."
"I pardon him,"
said Renzo,
"with all my heart."
"And you do well. It is your duty. But we may also thank heaven for delivering us from him. Now, if you wish to be married, I am ready. As to the order for your seizure, that is of little importance. The plague has carried off that too. If you choose, today is Thursday, on Sunday I will publish the banns, and then I shall have the happiness of uniting you."
"You know we came for that purpose,"
said Renzo.
"Very well, and I will send word of it to His Eminence."
"Who is His Eminence?"
asked Agnes.
"His Eminence? Our Lord Cardinal Archbishop, whom may God preserve."
"Oh, as to that, you are mistaken. I can tell you they do not call him so, because the second time we went to speak with him, one of the priests drew me aside and told me I must call him your illustrious lordship and my lord."
"And now, if that same priest were to tell you, he would say you must call him your Eminence. The Pope has ordered that this title be given to the cardinals. And do you know why? Because most illustrious was assumed by so many people who had no right to it. By and by they will call the bishops your Eminence. Then the abbots will claim it, then the canons."
"And the curates?"
said the widow.
No, let the curates alone for that. They will be only your reverence to the end of the world. But to return to our affairs, on Sunday I will publish the banns at the church, and obtain in the meantime a dispensation for omitting the 2 other publications. There will be plenty of similar applications if things go on elsewhere as they do here. The fire has taken. No one will wish to live alone, I imagine. I have already 3 marriages on hand besides yours. What a pity Perpetua is dead. She might find a husband. And at Milan, signora, I imagine it is the same thing.
Yes, indeed. In my parish alone there were 50 marriages last Sunday.
Well, the world won't end yet. And you, signora, has no butterfly begun to fly around you?
No, I think not of it. I do not mean to think of it.
Oh, yes. Would you be alone indeed? Agnes also.
You have a mind to jest,
said Agnes.
To be sure I have. It is high time. We may hope that the few days that remain to us will be less sad. As for me, poor old man, there is no remedy for years, as they say. Senectus ipsa est moribus.
Oh, now,
said Renzo,
you may speak Latin as much as you like. I don't care about it now.
You still quarrel with Latin, do you? Well, I will not forget you. When you come before me with Lucy to pronounce some little words in Latin, I will say to you, you do not like Latin, go in peace. Eh?
Ah, it is not that Latin I dislike, pure and holy like that of the Mass. I speak of the Latin which falls on one as a traitor, in the very midst of conversation. For example, now that we are here, and all is past, the Latin you spoke there, in that corner, to make me understand that you could not, and I know not what. Tell me now in language I can understand, will you?
Hush, you mischievous fellow, hush,
said Don Abbondio.
Do not stir up old grievances. If we were to settle our accounts, I do not know which of us would be in debt to the other. I have forgiven you, but you also played me an ill turn. As for you, it did not astonish me, because you are a good-for-nothing fellow. But I speak of the silent, this little saint. One would have thought it a sin to distrust her. But I know who advised her. I know, I do,
added he, pointing to Agnes. It is impossible to describe the change which had come over him. His mind, so long the slave of continual apprehension, was now emancipated from its fetters, and his tongue, liberated from its bonds, recurred to its former habits. He playfully prolonged the conversation, even following them to the door with some parting jest. The following morning Don Abbondio received a visit, as agreeable as it was unexpected, from the Lord Marquis, whose appearance confirmed all that report had said of him.
"I come,"
said he,
"to bring you the salutations of the Cardinal Archbishop."
Oh, what condescension in both of you!
When I took leave of that incomparable man, who honours me with his friendship, he spoke to me of 2 young people of this parish who have suffered much from the unfortunate Don Roderick. My lord wishes to hear of them. Are they living? Are their affairs settled?
Their affairs are settled, and I had thought of writing to his eminence about it, but now that I have the honour—
Are they here?
Yes, and as soon as possible they will be man and wife.
I request you to tell me what I can do for them, and the best manner of doing it. You will render me a service by enabling me to dispose of some of my superfluous wealth for their benefit.
May heaven reward you. I thank you in the name of my children,
said Don Abbondio.
And since your lordship allows me, I have an expedient to suggest, which perhaps will not displease you. These good people have resolved to establish themselves elsewhere, and to sell the little that belongs to them here. The best charity you can render them is to buy their property, as otherwise it will be sold for little or nothing. But your lordship will decide. I have spoken in obedience to your commands.
The Marquis thanked Don Abbondio, telling him he should leave it to him to fix the price, and to do so entirely to their advantage, as it was an object with him to make the amount as large as possible. He then proposed that they should go together to the cottage of Lucy. On their way, Don Abbondio, quite overjoyed, continued the conversation.
Since your lordship is so disposed to benefit this people, there is another service you can render them. The young man has an order for his apprehension out against him, for some folly he committed 2 years ago at Milan on the day of the great tumult. A recommendation, a word, from a man like yourself, might hereafter be of service to him.
Are there not heavy charges against him?
They made a great deal of noise about it, but really there was nothing in it.
Well, well, I will take it upon myself to free him from all embarrassment.
We may imagine the surprise of our little company at a visit from such a guest. He entered agreeably into conversation with them, and after a while made his proposal. Don Abbondio, being requested by him to fix the price, did so. The purchaser said he was well satisfied, and, if he had not understood him, in repeating it, doubled the sum. He would not hear of rectifying the mistake, and ended the conversation by inviting the company to dinner that day after the wedding, when the affair could be settled with every necessary formality.
Ah,
thought Don Abbondio when he returned home.
If the pestilence acted everywhere with so much discrimination, it would be a pity to speak ill of it. We should want one every generation.
The happy day at length arrived. The betrothed went to the church, where they were united by Don Abbondio. The day after, the wedding party made their visit at the castle. We will leave to the reader to imagine the reflections on entering those walls. In the midst of their joy, however, they felt that the presence of the good Father Christopher was wanting to complete it.
But,
said Lucy,
he is even happier than we are, assuredly.
The contract was drawn up by a doctor, but not at Zeccagarbugli. He was gone to Canterelli. For those who are not of this country, an explanation of this expression may be necessary. About half a mile above Lecco, and nearly on the borders of the other territory called Castello, is Canterelli. This was a spot where 2 roads cross. Near the point of junction there is a small eminence, an artificial hill surmounted by a cross. This was a heap of bodies, dead of this epidemic. It is true, tradition simply says the dead of the epidemic, but it must have been this one, as it was the last and most severe within the memory of man, and we know that tradition says very little of itself unless we render it some assistance. On their return, no other inconvenience was felt than the weight of the money which Renzo had to sustain. However, he did not look upon this as one of the greatest hardships he had had to encounter. There was, however, one matter which perplexed him not a little. How should he employ it? Should it be in agriculture? Should it be in business? Or why choose at all? Were not both in turn, like one's legs, better than either singly? It will be asked, did they feel no regrets on quitting their native village, their native mountains? Don Roderick and his wretched agents could no longer disturb them. Regrets they did feel, but the old recollections of happiness enjoyed amidst its scenes had been greatly weakened by recent distresses and apprehensions, and new hopes had arisen connected with their new country, so that they could look to their change of abode without any feelings of grief. The little company now thought only of preparing for their journey, the Trameglino family to their new country, and the widow to Milan. Many tears were shed, many thanks given, and many promises to meet again. The separation of Renzo and the friend who had treated him so hospitably was not less tender. Neither did they part coldly from Don Abbondio. They had always preserved a certain respect for their curate, and he in his heart had always wished them well. It is these unfortunate affairs of the world which perplex our affections. But who would believe that in this new abode, where Renzo had expected such happiness, he should find only vexation? This was the result of trifles, doubtless, but it requires so little to disturb a state of happiness in this life. The reports the Bergamascans had heard of Lucy, together with Renzo's extraordinary attachment to her, perhaps, too, the representations of some partial friend, had contributed to excite an extravagant idea of her beauty. When Lucy appeared, they began to shrug their shoulders and say,
"Is this the woman? We expected something very different."
What is she, after all? A peasant like 1,000 others?
Women like her, and fairer than she, are to be found everywhere.
Unfortunately, some kind friends told Renzo these things, perhaps added to what they had heard, and roused his indignation.
"And what consequence is it to you?"
said he.
"Who told you what to expect? Did I ever do so? Did I tell you she was beautiful? She is a peasant, forsooth. Did I ever say I would bring a princess here? She does not please you. Do not look at her, then. You have beautiful women, look at them."
Thus did he make himself unhappy, and believing that all were disposed to criticize his Lucy, he showed ill nature in return. It would have gone ill with him if he had been condemned to remain in the place. But fortune smiled on him in this respect. The master of another manufactory, situated near the gates of Bergamo, being dead, the inheritor of it, a young libertine, was willing to sell at half price for ready money. Bortolo proposed to his cousin that they should make the purchase together. They did so, and when they entered into possession, Lucy was much pleased, and Renzo also, and not the less so for having heard that more than one person amongst his neighbours had said,
"Have you seen this beautiful simpleton who is just come?"
Their affairs now went on prosperously. Before the year was completed, a beautiful little creature made her appearance, as if to give him the earliest opportunity of fulfilling Lucy's vow. Be it assured, it was named Maria. In the course of time, they were surrounded by others of both sexes, whom Agnes was delighted to carry about one after the other, calling them little rogues and loading them with kisses. They were all taught to read and write.
"For,"
said Renzo,
"as this notion is in the country, we may as well take advantage of it."
It was highly pleasing to hear him relate his adventures. He always concluded by naming the great things he had learnt, by which to govern his conduct for the future.
"I have learnt,"
said he,
"not to mix in quarrels, not to preach in public, not to drink more than I want, not to keep my hand on the knocker of a door when the inhabitants of the place are all crazy, not to tie a little bell to my feet before I think of the consequences."
"And I?"
said Lucy, who thought that the doctrine of her moralist, though sound, was rather confused and certainly incomplete.
"What have I learnt?"
she said.
"I have not sought misfortunes. They have sought me. Unless you say,"
smiling affectionately,
"that my error was in loving you, and promising myself to you."
They settled the question by deciding that misfortunes most commonly happen to us from our own misconduct or imprudence, but sometimes from causes independent of ourselves, that the most innocent and prudent conduct cannot always preserve us from them, and that, whether they arise from our own fault or not, trust in God softens them and renders them useful in preparing us for a better life. Although this was said by poor peasants, it appears to us so just that we offer it here as the moral of our story. End of chapter 37. End of The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, translated by George William Fenshaw.